Hi and welcome to this video lecture for Introduction to Philosophy, and today we're going to be talking about ancient Chinese philosopher Mencius. Mencius was one of the fourth generation of pupils of Confucius, so he was part of the Confucian tradition in ancient China, one of Confucius' most famous disciples or followers. He was around from 371 to 289 BC or BCE, and he outlined this sort of new position on human nature that's kind of interesting and gives us I think, perspective to compare with Glaucon, and also to compare with a Confucian philosopher who followed Mencius, and that was Sun Tzu. So we'll be having a look at his theory of cultivation as well this week. So let's take a look at Mencius and his kind of positive idea of human nature and see how he arrives at this point. So for Mencius, morality or ethics is about intuition and feeling, or it starts with this intuition and feeling that we're all kind of naturally born with. So all men have a mind which cannot bear to see the sufferings of others. So there's this emotional or sort of intuitional basis, this feeling basis for moral thinking, that we find the suffering of other people to be unbearable. And Mencius emphasizes this and the connection of kind of goodness as something that we're born with, that is already with us as children. In other words, it's not something that has to be sort of cultivated over a lifetime. Mencius says the great man is he who does not lose his child's heart. So it's already there in essence. It's already there in kind of in principle. It's already there in development in children. And the task of growing is to kind of continue to just kind of cultivate that child's heart and not lose it. So there's a basis in feeling that moral behavior is about feeling the right way. Right and wrong starts in these feelings that we have towards the suffering of others. So Mencius's view of human nature Mencius's view reflects this idea, and it's expressed in the idea of Xing Shan, which is that human nature possesses tendencies towards goodness. So Xing is the picture of human nature, and it possesses these tendencies towards goodness, towards sort of positive action. So all men, as we saw, cannot bear to see the suffering of others. This is evidence that we have this innate tendency, that we're born with, this innate tendency towards goodness. So Mencius gives us this example on page 47 in the text, that if men suddenly see a child about to fall into a well, they will, without exception, experience a feeling of alarm and distress. Okay, so the tendency of a child that's about to experience suffering, Mencius says, fills everybody with this feeling of alarm and distress. That's a kind of a natural, unadulterated condition, is to experience that sense of distress when we see a child suffering or a child in danger, and that reflects our human nature and its sort of basis in these feelings of goodness. So Mencius goes on to say that they don't save the child from self-interested reasons. In other words, it's not about gaining favor from the child's parents or winning a good reputation. Remember, those are the things that we saw were the sort of the reputation and rewards. Those are the things that are prevalent in Glaucon's story, in the story of Gaiji's ring. That's sort of what it's about: winning power and winning a good reputation. But for Mencius, these are not the motivating things here. Instead, this is an example of the natural human tendency for compassion, for caring about others. And this feeling is the basis of the virtue of compassion that we develop by cultivating our natural instincts. So our natural instincts, Mencius calls our sprouts, and we cultivate them and develop them into genuine virtues. So let's have a look at the four sprouts and how they lead to the four virtues. So the root one is the compassion, which is develops into the virtue of humanity, or the original term here is Ren, right, which suggests a kind of a communal sort of focus, a kind of focus on the well-being of humanity. And the second sprout, Mencius says, we have a sense of shame. And if we sort of cultivate that, it leads to the virtue of rightness, knowing what things are appropriate, what things are inappropriate. We also have the sort of sprout of modesty, and again that develops into propriety or lin. So sort of being able to do the right thing, being able to follow the right ritual, the right rule, the right sort of the right idea in a social context. So being able to do the right thing and being able to act with the appropriate sort of modesty and the appropriate way of comporting yourself in that situation. And the last one is right and wrong, which develops the sense of right and wrong, which develops into the virtue of wisdom or ji. So the examples Mencius gives for a number of these, the first one, the humanity, the compassion, is the child in the well. And if we develop that sort of sense of compassion, that sense of feeling for others' pain, that develops into the virtue of humanity. The second one, Mencius gives this example that even a beggar will refuse food if it's given with contempt. In other words, if it embodies a sense of shame, if it's shameful to receive it because of the way it's given. So that emphasizes the sense of shame and a sense that things have no value. Things are not right if they're not done in the right way, if they're not done with a sense of rightness. On the third one, modesty and propriety, Mencius gives this example of at some time in some place, people began leaving their parents in open ditches instead of burying them. And the sort of sight of this and the smell of it generated this sort of this sense that something was seriously wrong. There was something wrong with the sense of propriety here, and so people sort of came back to the correct way of burying parents. But we see we see the sense of how these sort of things work and how they sort of some things fall under the sort of threaten our modesty, some things threaten our sense of shame, some things call out our compassion. So it's our emotions being sort of called out in these ways, and if we cultivate them, as we'll see, they develop into these virtues into these separate virtues that are properly and fully developed. So I've been using the idea of cultivation, and that idea is very important to Mencius. In his work, he uses metaphors like domesticated plants, channeled irrigated water, and the idea of things sort of growing according to their own nature, sort of flowing, or water sort of flowing according to its own nature, flowing downhill. So there's a sense that things, or the sprouts in our sort of, the sprouts that we're born with, the sort of sprouts of compassion and modesty and so on, need to be cultivated and cared for. That we need to cultivate and care for those things in order to lead to the development of a human virtue. So cultivating them is sort of promoting them and sort of giving them space to exercise themselves, sort of working on them, refining them. So there's a kind of work here, but it's bringing out the natural tendency itself, not fighting against it, but sort of bringing out our natural tendency towards goodness and kind of just directing it and helping it and sort of helping it grow by giving it the resources it needs. So that's the model of how, for Mencius, we become fully good, and how we develop the virtues by sort of cultivating our natural sprouts of goodness. In time, we develop the virtues that allow us to live ethically. So, how can we explain how people do good things? It's a good example from 2007 of Wesley Autry. He was just a New Yorker standing on the subway. But while he was standing on the subway, there was another man there who was obviously in distress, and who collapsed and fell onto the train tracks. So Wesley Autry knew that he wasn't going to be able to sort of go down and pull the man off the track. He was sort of, he was obviously struggling. He didn't have time to do that. So instead what he did is he rolled himself and the man into a narrow ditch in the middle of the tracks, and the train rolled over the pair, barely missing them, but ultimately not hurting them. So he did something incredible to save somebody else's life. So it's an interesting question here as we talk about goodness. What is it that motivates Wesley Autry, or what is it that motivates people to do something like that? Is it just a natural action? Does it come from, say, our nature, that we have feelings of compassion, and that's why Wesley Autry feels this instinct to sort of save this person and put his own life at risk? Or is it a kind of habit? Is it something that we learn? Wesley Autry was actually, I think he was in the Navy for a number of years, so obviously he learned a number of sort of techniques of self-protection and so on. So is it kind of training? Is it sort of the character we give ourselves? So it depends how we read this situation, right? What's going on? Is he reasoning? Is he just acting by a kind of feeling or emotion, or is it an emotion that's kind of been developed into a kind of virtue, into a character trait? What is it that's sort of motivating him to do this? So we can ask this question when we find examples of ethical action like this, of people putting themselves at risk for others. What's the motivation, right? It's obviously not a familial or a tribal thing, because he's not related to the person that he saves. So what makes us feel these connections with people we don't know? So to get back to Mencius, one thing we can say about Mencius is that his view that people are naturally good, and that if we sort of allow them to cultivate their sprouts, they develop into the virtues. Well, one response to this is that, well, bad people exist, right? So how can we explain their existence if everybody is born with these sprouts of goodness? Everybody is born with sprouts of goodness. Why is it that some people turn out to be bad, right? What happened to their sprouts? And this is the issue that Mencius is addressing with the parable of, or the story of Ox Mountain. In the text, it's actually on page 50 in the text. It's called New Mountain, N-I-U. It's more commonly known as Ox Mountain, the story, so I'm going to just call it that. But in the text, it's New Mountain. But anyway, so if we follow the story, there was a fine forest on the Ox Mountain, near the capital of a populous country. Men came out with axes and cut down the trees. Was it still a fine forest, yet resting in the alternation of days and nights, moistened by dew, the stumps sprouted and the trees began to grow again. Then out came goats and cattle to browse on the young shoots. The Ox Mountain was stripped utterly bare, and the people seeing it stripped utterly bare think that the Ox Mountain never had any woods on it at all. So here's where Mencius draws out what's in this parable. He says, "Our mind too, stripped bare like the mountain, still cannot be without some basic tendency to love. But just as men with axes, cutting down the trees every morning, destroy the beauty of the forest, so we, by our daily actions, destroy our right mind. Day follows night, giving rest to the murdered forest. The moisture of the dawn spirit awakens in us the right loves, the right aversions. With the actions of one morning, we cut down this love and destroy it again. At last, the night spirit is no longer able to revive our right mind. Where then do our likes and dislikes differ from those of animals? In nothing much. Men see us and say we never had in us anything but evil. Is this man's nature?" So this idea, when we see people doing bad things, when we see the evil in man's nature, Mencius is saying that there's a story like this that's taken place, that there's this sort of, that instead of cultivating their sprouts, what's happened is that people have neglected them, they've been rough with them, they've been in environments that have really destroyed what was the sort of potential of those sprouts. Just like on Ox Mountain, where the trees are cut down and then the goats begin to sort of browse on the young shoots. The young shoots don't have a chance to survive. They don't have a chance to develop to be cultivated into the full virtues that they should become. So it looks like Mencius says, if we look at this, we'll say, well, people, they turned out to be evil. But what's happened is a failure of cultivation. It's the failure to cultivate those sprouts. And that's why what happens is a kind of destruction of our potential for goodness. So for Mencius, this is a kind of perversion of our potential for goodness that happens when our sprouts are not properly cultivated, when we don't properly develop that sort of potential that's in us for goodness. Whatever is cultivated rightly, Mencius says, will surely grow. Whatever is not cultivated rightly must surely perish. As Confucius said, grasp it firmly and you will keep it. Grasp it loosely and it will vanish out of your hand. Its comings and goings have no fixed times. No one knows its country. Of man's right mind, of this only does he speak. So everything depends on how we cultivate. Everything depends on how we develop those sprouts and whether they're allowed to sort of grow into the virtues. And the reason people become bad is because of a perversion of that potential. When our sprouts are crushed, when they're suppressed, when they're not promoted, when they're in an environment which doesn't allow them to grow, which is sparse, which doesn't give them water and nutrition, right? That's when we sort of see their withering away. We see them not developing. So there's a number of important ideas that we could think about based on Mencius's view of human nature and his view of ethics as sort of developing our sprouts. And the first is a focus on this question of nature or nurture, which is more important for ethics. And we might say for Mencius that nature is more important, since we sort of born with these sprouts by nature. But we've also seen from the story of Ox Mountain that if we don't sort of nurture and cultivate them, then they wither and perish. So nurture is important too. It's not just having the right natural endowment, the right sort of natural sprouts. We also have to be in the right environment that cultivates them. Otherwise, they're going to wither and perish, and we'll be sort of, we'll be left without their sort of guidance. So both seem to be important for developing an ethical perspective. Second is, how do we distinguish something seeming right from being right? I've seen that Mencius has a view of feeling as being very important to our moral sense, that it starts in this sort of feelings of right and wrong. We have this feeling of compassion, feeling of shame. So the issue here is how can we distinguish when we're actually right from when we think we're right? In other words, how do we distinguish seeming from seeming good, from actually being good. Um, and here we'd have to think about motives and how we sort of get into thinking about the relevant motives for doing things. What would Mencius say to Glaucon? Right, we've seen Glaucon's view that people are self-interested and they look after their own well-being. What would Mencius say about that? Presumably, having seen the story of Ox Mountain, we might imagine Mencius saying something about how what Glaucon presents as human nature is actually the position of people whose sort of sprouts have been worn away by a sort of bad social environment. So rather than that being this kind of natural, the picture of human nature, Mencius would say that's what happens when we're put into these nurture environments that don't actually develop our natural goodness, that sort of encourage us to look out for ourselves and allow self-interest to sort of overpower our natural feelings of goodness. So it's a kind of, for Mencius, what Glaucon presents as human nature is actually the result of a kind of distortion or a perversion of the development of human nature when we sort of put in bad environments, and that leads to a sort of a focus on our self-interest above everything else, and that those sort of moral relations that we have, those feelings that sort of link us in moral relations with other people, they kind of disappear. And at that point, once those the sort of our natural moral feelings have kind of disappeared, it's only the law or convention that keeps us from injuring or doing bad things to one another once the moral motivation is not there. Mencius also talks a lot about the importance of moral models, of people seeing moral models and being able to follow them, follow people who provide the right models for moral action. Interesting question here. What moral models might people follow today? Does our society provide the right kind of models that we might look at as sort of ethical models for conduct? Where would we look for those kind of models for today? What kind of realm allows us to see that, allows us to see people as moral models? Does that exist today in any sort of shape or form? So that's one thing to sort of think about as well. For Mencius, that's an important question, how we sort of learn from moral models. And it would be an interesting question to think about who our teachers might be today on that question.